Imagine a world where one bold decision by a global superpower ignites a chain reaction that reshapes the geopolitical landscape. One missile, one strike, and suddenly, lines that were once blurred become bold. Allies declare themselves, enemies emerge from the shadows, and the world holds its breath. If the United States were to launch a direct attack on Iran, the consequences would be far more complex than a simple battlefield engagement. It would trigger a global recalibration of alliances, interests, ideologies, and power plays. The question isn't just what America might do, but who would rise in support of Iran if that moment came. In today's video, we're diving into a deeply sensitive and high-stakes geopolitical scenario. We're exploring the nations that are most likely to support Iran if the United States initiates a direct military confrontation. This is not just about missiles and armies. It's about history, shared ideologies, strategic interests, and quiet understandings that span decades. From powerful regional neighbors to distant ideological partners, a wide range of players might be pulled into the fold. To truly understand who might back Iran and why, we have to step far beyond today's headlines and look at the long, tangled web of history and power that connects these nations. Iran's place on the global stage is unlike any other. It sits at the crossroads of centuries-old civilizations, at the heart of energy-rich territory, and in a region that has long been a chessboard for global superpowers. It's a country with a complex identity, proudly Persian, staunchly Shia, and fiercely independent in its foreign policy. Since the 1979 Islamic Revolution, Iran has positioned itself as a resistance power, resisting Western domination, particularly American influence, and often aligning itself with movements and nations that share that resistance mindset. So when we ask who would support Iran in a time of war, we're not just asking who likes Iran. We're asking who shares its grievances, its goals, or stands to gain from weakening American influence. First, let's look at the most obvious ally, Iran's neighbor to the north, Russia. The Iran-Russia relationship is built on shared strategic interests, especially in the Middle East. They've cooperated militarily in Syria to prop up the Assad regime, which both nations see as a vital piece of the anti-Western puzzle. Moscow sees Iran as a counterbalance to US power in the region and a useful partner in undermining NATO and American influence. More than just rhetoric, Russia has supplied Iran with advanced military technology, including the S-300 air defense system, and more recently, collaborations on drones and missile systems. If the United States were to strike Iran, Russia might not launch missiles in Iran's defense, but it would almost certainly provide intelligence, weapons, cyber capabilities, and political cover in international forums like the United Nations. In a scenario where open war erupts, Russia's indirect involvement would be both strategic and symbolic, drawing yet another front in its ongoing rivalry with the West. Now let's move east, to a rising superpower with global ambitions, China. China's relationship with Iran is rooted in economic necessity and political pragmatism. Beijing is the largest buyer of Iranian oil, and despite US sanctions, it has continued importing energy through backdoor mechanisms and quiet deals. But beyond oil, China sees Iran as a critical node in its Belt and Road Initiative, its massive global infrastructure project that aims to reshape trade routes and enhance Chinese influence across Asia and beyond. Militarily, China has refrained from deep engagements in the Middle East, but in a hypothetical US-Iran war, things might change. China may not send troops, but it would likely ramp up diplomatic resistance to the war, supply Iran with economic aid, and ensure continued access to oil through its network of maritime and land routes. China's involvement would be more covert than Russia's, but just as consequential. It would work to turn Iran into a fortress of resistance, while painting the US as the destabilizing force in global affairs, especially for its audience in the global south. Then there's Iraq. Historically, Iran and Iraq were bitter enemies, locked in a brutal war during the 1980s. But in the post-Saddam era, Iran has become one of the most influential powers inside Iraq. Through a network of Shia militias, political allies, and economic ties, Iran has essentially built a deep state within Iraq's borders. These groups, many of which are armed, trained, and ideologically loyal to Tehran, would not stand idle if Iran came under direct American attack. Iraq's central government might try to remain neutral, but on the ground you can expect massive mobilization of Iran-backed militias. These groups have already been involved in targeting US forces in Iraq over the years, and would likely escalate operations dramatically. Iraq could become a second front in the war, not because Baghdad declares it, but because Iran's influence in Iraqi territory is real and operational. The result would be chaos in a country already struggling to maintain stability. And what about Syria? Bashar al-Assad's government owes its survival to Iran and Russia. Tehran has poured billions into Syria, deploying IRGC forces, Hezbollah fighters, and other proxies to help Assad regain control over rebel-held territories. Syria has effectively become an extension of Iran's strategic depth. In a conflict with the US, Syria would allow Iran to operate militarily through its territory, launch strikes against US allies in the region, and offer a strategic corridor that connects Tehran to Hezbollah in Lebanon. Syria would not just support Iran politically, it would serve as a battlefield. That brings us to Hezbollah, the Lebanese militant group and political party that is perhaps Iran's most powerful non-state ally. With tens of thousands of rockets, sophisticated guerrilla tactics, and decades of battlefield experience, Hezbollah is more than just a militia. It's an extension of Iran's regional strategy. If the US attacked Iran, Hezbollah would almost certainly open a front in northern Israel, targeting US interests and allies. Its leader, Hassan Nasrallah, has repeatedly stated that Hezbollah's fate is tied to Iran's. Their shared ideological and strategic goals make Hezbollah one of the first and most dangerous responders in any US-Iran war. Beyond the Middle East, there are other players, not all of them traditional allies, but ones that may support Iran out of shared interest or mutual distrust of the US. Venezuela, under Nicolás Maduro, has formed a close economic and political relationship with Iran. Both countries are under heavy American sanctions and have helped each other bypass restrictions through oil swaps, technology exchanges, and military cooperation. In a war scenario, Venezuela could offer logistics, intelligence sharing, and propaganda support, amplifying anti-American sentiment across Latin America. North Korea is another wild card. Isolated, nuclear-armed, and perpetually in conflict with the United States, North Korea has quietly maintained ties with Iran over the years, particularly in missile technology. While Pyongyang may not involve itself directly, it could increase weapons transfers or open a parallel front of tension to stretch American attention and resources. North Korea supporting Iran wouldn't just be symbolic. It would be part of a larger strategy to weaken US global dominance. We also have to consider the role of regional actors like Qatar and Oman, countries that, while not military powers, have maintained cordial relations with Iran. Qatar, despite hosting a major US airbase, has deep economic ties with Tehran, particularly through the shared South Pars/North Dome gas field. While Qatar may not openly support Iran, it could play a quiet diplomatic role, possibly resisting full-throated support for US military action or serving as a back channel for de-escalation. Oman, known for its neutrality and discreet diplomacy, might help Iran withstand economic shocks and provide space for international dialogue, effectively becoming a buffer against escalation. Then there's Pakistan. Officially neutral and historically aligned with the US, on paper, Pakistan also shares a border with Iran and has a significant Shia population. Though unlikely to offer military support, Pakistan might resist American pressure to cut ties with Tehran. If conflict escalates and spills into the region, Islamabad might quietly aid Iran in terms of humanitarian routes or limited intelligence, especially if public sentiment swings against a US war. All of these dynamics suggest that a US attack on Iran would not isolate Tehran. It would activate a constellation of alliances, networks, and partnerships that have been forged over decades. Some of these allies would fight directly, others would support economically, diplomatically, or ideologically. But the result would be a global fragmentation. America and its NATO allies on one side, Iran and a web of state and non-state actors on the other, and many countries caught in the middle. And we haven't even gotten into Turkey's complex position, the reactions of India, or how Africa might respond based on China-Iran alliances. Let's pause here. In the second half of this video, we'll explore the domino effects of such a war, how Europe might react, how Iran's soft power through the Shia crescent would escalate regional chaos, and how global energy markets, cyber warfare, and asymmetric responses would forever alter the balance of power. Stay tuned, and if you think this scenario sounds far-fetched, remember, in the world of geopolitics, yesterday's impossibilities can become today's headline. Let's now move deeper into the scenario. If war breaks out between the United States and Iran, the conflict would not remain a two-party affair. It would ripple outward, sparking secondary crises, destabilizing regions, and triggering diplomatic chaos on multiple continents. One of the first to feel the shock would be the European Union. Now, many European nations, France, Germany, the UK, have long-standing alliances with the United States through NATO. But when it comes to Iran, Europe's position has always been more complicated. Following the US withdrawal from the Iran nuclear deal in 2018, European countries tried desperately to salvage the agreement. They saw it as the most viable path to prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons, and also as a mechanism to preserve stability in the Middle East. So if America launches a strike against Iran, many in Europe will view it not as an act of defense, but as an act of provocation, especially if it's done without broad international consensus. While NATO's Article 5 might not be invoked, political pressure will mount on European governments to support the US militarily, logistically, or diplomatically. But this support won't be universal. Countries like Germany and Spain might resist deeper involvement, especially if their populations view the war as unjust or strategically unnecessary. There could be widespread protests, division within NATO, and a re-evaluation of how far Europe is willing to follow America into open confrontation with Iran. Now, let's shift focus back to the Middle East, because the region itself will become a pressure cooker. Iran's network of proxies stretching from Yemen to Lebanon, known as the Axis of Resistance, would be fully activated. In Yemen, the Houthis have already demonstrated their ability to strike American-aligned targets, especially in the Red Sea. If the US attacks Iran, the Houthis could escalate attacks on US ships, Gulf oil infrastructure, and Israeli interests. This would not just disrupt military strategy, it would cripple global oil supplies. The Strait of Hormuz, through which 1/5 of the world's oil passes, would become a flashpoint. Iran has repeatedly threatened to close the strait in the event of war, and while doing so would invite massive retaliation, it would also send energy markets into chaos. Oil prices could skyrocket, pushing inflation across the world and creating a global economic crisis. Countries that depend on Middle Eastern oil, India, Japan, South Korea, would suddenly find themselves caught in a crisis that directly impacts their economies, even if they had no intention of picking a side. Speaking of India, its position would be particularly delicate. On one hand, India has growing strategic ties with the US, especially through initiatives like the Quad, and shared concerns about China. On the other hand, India has deep energy and cultural ties with Iran. Historically, Iran was one of India's largest oil suppliers, and it also plays a key role in India's access to Central Asia through the Chabahar port. Moreover, India has a significant Shia population that could be politically activated if the war becomes a religiously charged conflict. So while India would likely try to remain neutral, it would face immense pressure from both sides. A prolonged war could force New Delhi to quietly lean toward Iran economically, while publicly maintaining a balanced diplomatic position to avoid antagonizing Washington. Turkey presents another fascinating wild card. As a NATO member, it has treaty obligations to the United States, but Turkey under President Erdogan has pursued an independent foreign policy, increasingly at odds with Western interests. Ankara has economic and energy interests with Iran, and it also positions itself as a leader in the Muslim world. A direct US strike on Iran could push Erdogan into a more confrontational stance toward Washington, especially if domestic politics. Turkey might not fight for Iran, but it could refuse to allow US operations from its bases, complicate NATO logistics, or act as a middle power pushing for de-escalation on its own terms. Africa is another region that might seem far removed from the Iran-US conflict, but it isn't. Over the past 2 decades, Iran has built quiet but significant diplomatic and economic relationships with several African nations. In places like Nigeria, where Shia movements exist, Tehran has offered ideological and sometimes financial support. In Sudan, prior to its normalization with Israel, Iran maintained strong military ties. While many African governments may not officially back Iran in a war, there could be large-scale public sympathy, particularly in regions where anti-American sentiment runs high. Protests, boycotts, and political resistance could emerge, complicating US diplomatic efforts across the continent. Let's not forget cyber warfare. Iran has heavily invested in cyber capabilities over the past decade. Its cyber army, though not as advanced as those of the US or China, has proven effective at targeting infrastructure, banks, and private corporations. In a war scenario, we would see a dramatic escalation in cyber attacks on oil pipelines, water systems, and financial institutions, not just in the United States, but across any country perceived as helping the American war effort. Likewise, American and Israeli cyber units would go on the offensive, attacking Iranian infrastructure, communications, and command centers. This shadow war in cyberspace would impact civilians far beyond the battlefield, disrupting electricity grids, disabling transportation systems, and possibly even affecting healthcare or emergency services. In the broader Islamic world, Iran's position is complicated. It's a Shia-majority country in a predominantly Sunni region, but if America attacks, the narrative could shift dramatically. Iran would attempt to position itself as the defender of Islamic sovereignty against Western aggression. This messaging could resonate deeply with populations in countries like Pakistan, Indonesia, Malaysia, and even parts of North Africa. Islamist groups, some aligned with Iran, some simply opposed to the US, could exploit the situation to expand their influence. Anti-American demonstrations would likely erupt worldwide, and in unstable regions, these protests could spiral into violence or insurgency. Meanwhile, international institutions like the United Nations would be paralyzed. The Security Council would be gridlocked, with Russia and China vetoing any resolution condemning Iran, while the US and its allies push for international legitimacy. Global bodies like the IMF or World Bank might be pressured to freeze Iranian assets or impose new sanctions, but many countries may resist these moves, especially if they believe the US acted unilaterally or without provocation. Even Israel, though not directly attacking Iran in this scenario, would be pulled into the vortex. Iran's missile range already covers Israeli territory, and in a full-scale war, Iran would likely launch retaliatory strikes. Hezbollah in the north and possibly groups in Syria or Gaza could open additional fronts. Israel's Iron Dome and other defense systems would be pushed to the limit, and the country might respond with overwhelming force. This could lead to regional war unlike anything the Middle East has seen in decades. So who supports Iran in this nightmare scenario? The answer is not as simple as flags and treaties. Support can come in many forms: military, economic, ideological, informational. Russia, China, Syria, Hezbollah, Iraq's militias, and the Houthis would be Iran's most active supporters, but many more would lend silent, logistical, or moral backing. Others would exploit the chaos for their own gain, reshaping alliances and redrawing maps in the process. The truth is, a US attack on Iran would not isolate Tehran. It would activate a global network of partnerships, sympathies, and rivalries, many of which have been simmering for years beneath the surface. It would expose the fragility of existing alliances, the shifting loyalties of emerging powers, and the deep undercurrents of resentment toward Western dominance that still run strong in many parts of the world. The real danger isn't just the war itself. It's the world it would leave behind. A world where old rules no longer apply, where neutral nations are forced to choose, where regional conflicts turn global, and the phrase, "support for Iran," might mean something different in every corner of the world. And perhaps most chilling of all, it would mark the beginning of a new era, not just of warfare, but of how global power is wielded, challenged, and reshaped in real time. Now let's explore the long-term consequences and broader global reactions in this hypothetical but deeply plausible scenario. If the United States were to launch a full-scale military attack on Iran, the war would not just be measured in airstrikes and counterstrikes. It would be waged across economies, ideologies, cultures, and digital spaces. And over time, the definition of support would shift from immediate military backing to deeper geopolitical realignment. One of the clearest consequences would be the erosion of American soft power. In the early 2000s, America's global dominance was still relatively unchallenged. But after 2 decades of controversial wars, economic crises, and shifting multipolarity, its moral authority has been weakened in many parts of the world. If it were to initiate another war, this time with a country like Iran, which many see as asserting its right to sovereignty, the global narrative could quickly turn against the United States. Even US allies in Europe and Asia may find it difficult to justify such a conflict to their own populations. Global trust in American leadership would be severely tested, particularly in regions like Latin America, Africa, and Southeast Asia, where historical grievances against Western intervention still run deep. This backlash could further empower rival powers, especially China and Russia, who would position themselves as protectors of global order against perceived American aggression. Their state media would weaponize the conflict for propaganda, framing the US as a destabilizing empire, while they offer themselves as defenders of sovereignty and multipolar diplomacy. Countries within the global south, many of whom are part of the BRICS alliance or aspire to join it, may not align militarily with Iran, but they may begin economically and diplomatically tilting further toward Beijing and Moscow. This ideological shift could gradually reduce the global dominance of Western institutions, including the dollar as the world's reserve currency. Meanwhile, Iran's model of resistance would gain ideological momentum. Despite being a Shia theocracy, Iran has long branded itself as a champion of oppressed peoples, from Palestine to Lebanon to Yemen. If it's attacked and survives, especially while drawing some form of support from multiple fronts, Iran's narrative would be cemented across regions that resent Western intervention. Groups in the Arab world, Central Asia, South Asia, and even parts of Africa might become more receptive to Iran's anti-imperialist messaging, giving Tehran a stronger soft power foothold than it has enjoyed in decades. Domestically, Iran would likely experience a wave of nationalism. Even Iranians who oppose the government might unite in defense of their homeland in the face of external aggression. This could consolidate power for Iran's leadership in the short term, reinforcing the legitimacy of its hardline factions. However, over the long haul, a prolonged war would stretch Iran's economy, exhaust its military resources, and create internal pressures that could either strengthen authoritarian control or lead to revolutionary change if the conflict becomes unsustainable. On the American side, the domestic reaction would be complex. Initial military victories might boost short-term nationalism or political approval, especially among constituencies that favor a strong-arm approach to foreign policy. But as costs mount, especially if American troops are deployed in large numbers, public opinion could sour quickly. The ghosts of Iraq and Afghanistan would resurface. Political divisions would widen. Protests could erupt. Questions would be asked. Why Iran? Why now? What's the exit strategy? Another critical domain of this conflict would be information warfare. Iran, Russia, China, and their affiliates have already demonstrated their capacity to influence digital narratives globally. A war with Iran would flood the internet with competing versions of the truth, each side accusing the other of war crimes, aggression, or hypocrisy. From Twitter to TikTok, from Telegram to state-run media outlets, the battle for hearts and minds would be constant and brutal. False flags, deepfakes, and cyber propaganda would erode public trust, not only in the combatant nations, but in the global information ecosystem as a whole. And we must not underestimate the role of religious solidarity. While Sunni Arab states like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Egypt might officially back the US, they would face enormous pressure from their populations, who might sympathize with Iran as a Muslim country standing up to the West. In countries like Bahrain, where Shia communities have long been marginalized, tensions could rise sharply. Pro-Iranian demonstrations, sectarian clashes, and even acts of domestic sabotage could spread across the Gulf region. In Pakistan, Indonesia, and Nigeria, countries with large Muslim populations, public anger could translate into political and security risks for governments seen as aligning too closely with the US. This broader religious dimension also empowers transnational groups, some tied to Iran, others simply inspired by anti-American fervor. New alliances could form, old jihadist groups could resurface or morph. A region already strained by instability could see a resurgence of insurgency, piracy, smuggling, and radicalism, exploiting the chaos for recruitment, funding, and operations. And then there's Israel. Any major strike on Iran would almost certainly be interpreted by Tehran as having Israeli fingerprints, whether that's true or not. Hezbollah, already deeply integrated with Iran's strategy, would launch rockets into northern Israel. Other groups, like Islamic Jihad or pro-Iranian cells in Syria and Iraq, could also engage. Israel's powerful military might handle the immediate threat, but it would come at a cost. Civilian casualties, international condemnation, and the possibility of facing multiple fronts simultaneously would stretch its defense posture. A prolonged war with Iran would tie Israel into a conflict it has long prepared for, but likely hoped to avoid. In the end, support for Iran wouldn't just be measured by who sends weapons or soldiers. It would be seen in diplomatic resistance, in sabotage operations, in trade networks that defy sanctions, in protests that erupt across distant capitals, and in ideologies that spread through universities, mosques, and media channels. Iran's allies would not always declare themselves on battlefields. They would act quietly, persistently, and globally. And herein lies the real risk of such a war. It wouldn't just remake the Middle East, it could remap the entire world order. By dragging in nuclear-armed states, inflaming sectarian divisions, destabilizing global markets, and empowering anti-Western movements, the cost would not be measured in dollars or days. It would be measured in decades. So the next time you hear talk of striking Iran as if it were a simple military decision, remember this: Iran is not isolated. It is connected by blood, by ideology, by necessity, and by resistance. A strike on Iran might light a fire that no one, not even its initiators, could control. And the countries that would support Iran? They're not just nations, they're systems, networks, beliefs. Some would act openly, others would act in silence, but they would act. And the world as we know it would never be the same again. Thanks for watching. If you found this analysis helpful, make sure to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. What do you think would happen if the US and Iran went to war? Would it be contained, or would it spark something much larger? Let's talk about it.